Keep your breath steady. Engage it. Yeah. Since we're at the end of this one, if you want to work on anything, if you want to work on any inversions, now's the time.
You know what? I'm actually pretty tired. Can we just do some asana?
In this scene, the complicated emotional terrain between India and Sovereign becomes a raw and deeply revealing portrait of how queer women navigate boundaries, accountability, and care in a world that often trains them to internalize the very forms of harm they are fighting against. And the interaction asks us to sit with the uncomfortable truth that women's relationships, whether professional, personal, queer-coded, or layered with unspoken intimacy, are shaped not only by desire and longing, but by the long shadows cast by past experiences, institutional failures, and the pressure to appear strong even when one is unraveling internally. From the moment Sovereign walks in, radiating a mixture of gentle firmness and genuine concern, the dynamic immediately signals that this is a conversation between two women who know each other beyond the surface level. Two women who have built a relationship through trust, through difficult decisions, through the shared knowledge of what it means to be women navigating public scrutiny. And what makes this scene resonate so strongly with queer audiences is not the presence of explicit romance, but the emotional intimacy, the kind of deep, attuned, quietly charged connection that queer women often recognize as familiar, as something that exists in the spaces between words, in the careful tone of a voice, in the way one woman reaches for understanding while the other tries to hold herself together. Sovereign's approach is not cold professionalism, but warm insistence, the way someone steps in when they refuse to let someone they care about self-destruct. And for many queer viewers, this dynamic mirrors the ways queer women often show up for each other in emotionally complex spaces, where attraction, admiration, and care intermingle with responsibility, conflict, and the fear of being misunderstood. India, for her part, enters the conversation like someone who has lived too long believing she must defend her every position, or risk being swallowed by people eager to twist her words. And queer women may see themselves reflected in that defensiveness. The pressure to always explain oneself. The need to assert autonomy in a world that too readily labels them unstable, dramatic, or irrational, and the instinct to bury one's own vulnerability under the armor of intellectual certainty. When Sovereign tells her that the piece may be harmful, she is not just addressing professional reputation, but addressing the deeper issue of how women learn to carry blame, how they internalize the belief that their own mistakes or misjudgments disqualify them from community support. And for many queer women, this cuts close to the bone. Because queer lives are so often shaped by narratives of fault, responsibility, misinterpretation, and the desire to reclaim control in situations where control was once taken from them. Sovereign embodies the emotional labor women often perform for one another. She is direct but gentle, committed but careful, willing to risk conflict because she refuses to let India walk into harm's path unprepared. And queer audiences may recognize in her the figure of the caretaker friend, the older queer or emotionally grounded woman who sees danger coming before you see it yourself, who pushes you not to police your behavior but to acknowledge your worth, your impact, your responsibility to yourself and to others. The nuance of their exchange lies in the subtle but potent emotional intimacy. Sovereign leaning forward, speaking softly but firmly, and India, defensive at first, gradually softening as her story spills out in fragments that reveal more through tone than through content. And while the script never frames their connection as explicitly romantic, queerness here is understood not as sexuality alone, but as the deeply interwoven emotional bonds queer women form when they find someone who listens, who believes them, who challenges them with love rather than judgment. The moment India finally opens up is one of those transformative, queer-coded scenes where vulnerability becomes a kind of communion. She tells Sovereign something deeply personal, something she does not share lightly, and Sovereign responds not with dismissal or discomfort, but with empathy, affirmation, and the steady acknowledgement that India's experiences shaped her worldview in ways she is still trying to untangle. And this is where queer women may see themselves most clearly. In the collapse of defenses, in the unmasking of pain, in the way India tries to make sense of how past wounds inform her present beliefs, and in the way Sovereign holds that confession with tenderness instead of recoil. Women who have lived through emotional turbulence, especially queer women who often navigate environments where their feelings and identities are dismissed, will recognize the poignancy of being truly heard, perhaps for the first time, and the scene becomes not just a critique of India's choices, but a moment where two women negotiate the boundaries of care, responsibility, and community accountability. Sovereign's concern about how the article might affect other women underscores a shared feminist ethic, one rooted in collective protection rather than individualism. and her insistence that the piece could hurt survivors reflects how queer communities often emphasize harm reduction and communal responsibility, values that arise from being historically marginalized and needing to rely on each other for survival. India's counter-argument, that she is simply sharing her perspective informed by her own life, highlights the complex tension many queer women navigate between owning their truth and understanding how that truth exists within larger power structures. And the emotional heart of the scene emerges when Sovereign gently points out that India might be using her writing as a way to wrestle with unresolved pain, a suggestion that lands not as condemnation but as an invitation to self-reflection. The tenderness of their final exchange, the way Sovereign reassures her, the way India allows herself to be comforted, the soft hug that lingers with emotional weight, feels unmistakably queer in its emotional texture. Two women navigating closeness that is rooted not in spectacle but in trust, in mutual recognition, in the unspoken yearning to be seen and supported. And queer audiences often understand that intimacy between women exists in these quiet gestures, in the moments where care becomes a form of connection that defies heteronormative expectations. The scene also challenges societal discomfort with women expressing profound care for each other, especially in professional or semi-professional contexts where boundaries are policed and emotional closeness is often dismissed or misread. And in doing so, it highlights how women, particularly queer women, must constantly negotiate the line between vulnerability and strength, between self-protection and openness, between independence and interdependence. Sovereign's final hug, asked for tentatively, granted with warmth, speaks to the longing queer women often feel to be held emotionally without their intentions being sexualized or misunderstood, and the way India melts into the embrace suggests a moment of release, a moment where she allows herself to be cared for despite her instinct to armor herself with intellect and contrarian arguments. It is a moment of queer visibility not because it portrays romance, but because it portrays the depth and legitimacy of women's emotional bonds, the kind of connection that society too often minimizes or fetishizes instead of honoring as a vital part of queer experience. Ultimately, this scene is not about desire, but about the emotional architecture queer women build with each other, the courage to confront, the strength to listen, the vulnerability to reveal scars, and the profound relief of realizing that someone is willing to hold your truth without recoiling or reducing you to your mistakes. It is a scene about accountability delivered through compassion, about two women navigating the messy intersections of personal history and public responsibility, and about the quiet, resilient intimacy that queer women create not through spectacle but through honesty, care, and the simple, radical act of staying present with one another even when the conversation is hard.